Okay, so imagine, just picture this. You're sitting down with, like, Washington, Adams, the big guys, and you hand them a copy of the Constitution, right? And you just ask them, like, hey, so how's this whole balance of power thing working out for you? And that's kind of what we're looking at today, like how their vision, back then stacks up against, like, all the crazy stuff happening in America right now.
Yeah, it's a trip, right?
Hmm.
We're using this blog by Andrej Karpathy. It's called Founding Fathers on Today's America. And get this, it was actually written by an AI o1-pro. It's basically this, like, thought experiment, trying to figure out how these dudes would react to, like, all the wild stuff happening in our modern world.
And believe me, things get pretty deep. Like,
Right.
the blog starts off tackling the whole constitutional framework under modern strain thing, and right off the bat, they hit you with this heavy quote. The founders conceived a constitutional order as a delicate balance of power among three branches of government.
Hmm.
It really makes you wonder, would they even recognize this massive federal government we've got going on today?
I doubt it. I mean, the sheer amount of power the feds have now, it would blow their minds. They wanted a small government, limited. But now we've got agencies regulating everything, you name it. Car emissions, internet privacy, stuff they couldn't even dream of back then.
It's like they built this super sleek, efficient machine, and we just kept adding on all these extra parts over the years. The blog even points out how the way we interpret certain parts of the Constitution now, like the Commerce Clause, has given the feds way more authority than they probably intended.
Yo, think about it like online shopping, right?
Hmm.
Goods and services flying across state lines every second. Do you think the founding fathers would have considered that interstate commerce? Makes you think about how their original ideas apply to, like, the whole digital age.
For sure. And then there's the whole balance between the branches of government. I mean, the founders were crystal clear that Congress was supposed to be the main lawmaker. But these days, we're seeing a lot more reliance on things like executive orders, which sometimes feel like they're sidestepping Congress altogether. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. And the founders would definitely be concerned about that. Like, how does that shift in power affect the whole system they worked so hard to create?
Hmm.
And then you've got the judiciary. Their role has evolved in ways they probably never saw coming.
Right. Like, they imagine the courts as these guardians of the Constitution. But today, the Supreme Court is ruling on things like, do corporations have free speech rights? Can the government track what we do online? It's wild. Makes you wonder how they'd feel about the courts having so much power to shape, like, the entire direction of the country on these super complicated issues.
It's a tough one. On one hand, they might see it as like a necessary adaptation, to keep up with the times. But on the other hand, they were so wary of any one branch getting too much power, so who knows?
And speaking of power, chapter 2 of the blog dives into this whole world of liberty and surveillance in the digital age. And it kicks off with this question, kind of gives you chills. It asks, how would the founders, champions of individual liberty, view the digital panopticon we live in today? Think about it. We leave digital footprints everywhere. Our phones know where we are. Everything we do online is tracked. Facial recognition cameras are popping up everywhere. How would they handle the fact that pretty much our entire lives can be watched and analyzed?
It goes against everything they stood for, right? Like their whole vision of a free society. They were adamant about protecting our persons, houses, papers, and effects, but all that spilled over into the digital world now in ways they couldn't have even imagined. Like, imagine explaining to them mass data collection, right? Governments, tech companies, everyone's grabbing our info. It's this web of surveillance. It's everywhere. It's inescapable.
Right. And don't forget, the founders were all about transparency and accountability, especially from the government. So how do you stay informed? How do you hold them accountable when you don't even know what they're collecting on you?
Exactly. And it gets even more blurry when you think about, like, where does government surveillance end and, like, what these private companies are doing begin. I mean, these tech giants, they know everything about us. And when the government can tap into that, it really makes you question, like, how much privacy have we actually lost?
It's a world away from the one they knew, right? Where, like, if you wrote a letter, it was actually private. I bet they'd be pushing for way more transparency, way more oversight when it comes to surveillance in this digital age.
Oh, for sure. They might even argue that some of the stuff that's happening now, like targeting people without any real reason, goes against the very idea of freedom in a democracy.
So it sounds like the founders would have some major concerns about how technology is messing with the balance of power and impacting our individual freedoms.
No doubt. But it's important to remember that they weren't naive. They knew that for a government to protect its people, It needs certain tools.
But they were also super suspicious of the government having too much power. So finding that sweet spot, that balance between security and freedom, that's where things get really interesting. And it's a balance that we, like everyone living in the 21st century, has to figure out every single day.
Exactly. The founders gave us the framework, the foundation, but they also knew that each generation has to adapt those principles to whatever challenges they face. And this digital age, man, it throws some curveballs when it comes to balancing individual rights with, like, keeping everyone safe.
So before we jump into the next chapter, which tackles how the founding fathers felt about something they absolutely hated, political parties, let's dig a little deeper into one area where this whole liberty versus security thing really plays out today. This whole thing with like tech companies and the government having so much power, it really makes you think about like whose voices are actually being heard in America these days,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
And that kind of leads us to chapter 3 in the blog, which gets into political parties and the founders' intentions. And this is where things get, like, kind of ironic.
Yeah, for sure. It's no secret that the founding fathers, well, they weren't exactly fans of political parties, were they?
Not at all.
They saw them as like these dangerous factions, like they could tear the whole country apart.
They were still kind of traumatized by all the political infighting they'd seen back in Europe, so they put all their hopes into the Constitution and, like, that system of checks and balances. They were really hoping it would prevent these, like, rigid party blocks from forming.
Right. And then, bam, almost as soon as they finished writing the Constitution, parties popped up everywhere. It's like the ultimate unintended consequence.
This
Right.
total plot twist. And now look at us. Fast forward to today. We've got these two massive parties that basically control everything in Washington.
Yeah, the level of like how ingrained they are in the system now,
Yeah.
it would probably shock the founders. We're talking huge fundraising networks, voter databases, all these strategists and stuff. It's nothing like what they had in mind. They were picturing citizen legislators where everyone's just focused on like reasoned debate and what's good for the country.
Yeah, but instead it feels like what comes first is like being loyal to your party no matter what. And you
Yeah.
gotta wonder, would the founders see this crazy partisanship as like a betrayal of their vision?
Hard to say for sure, but they'd definitely be troubled by how party politics can overshadow like actually doing what's best for everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Like compromise has become a dirty word and it's all about winning no matter what instead of finding solutions that work for everybody.
Totally. It's like we've traded like having real debates about the issues for this never-ending tug of war between these two teams. The blog even points out how the primary system, which is something the founders didn't even have, is making this whole partisanship thing even worse.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. The way primaries work, especially in those districts where like one party always wins, it kind of rewards the most extreme candidates, right? The ones who really appeal to like the hardcore party base, but maybe not so much to everyone else. And that just pushes the parties further apart, making it even harder to find any middle ground.
Okay, so it sounds like the founders wouldn't be too happy with our two-party system, but the blog does say that they weren't totally clueless about, like, the realities of politics. I mean, some of them, like Jefferson and Madison, they ended up playing pretty big roles in how early political parties developed.
True, they weren't completely naive about it. They understood that in a country as big and diverse as America, having some kind of organized groups to represent different interests might be inevitable, right? And maybe they'd even admit that parties can give voters like a clearer choice between different ideas and policies.
Right.
You know,
So maybe it's not like they completely condemn parties, but it's more like they're cautious about the potential downsides, right? Like, hey, parties can exist, but we got to figure out how to keep them from like taking over the whole system.
exactly. They'd probably be all about finding ways to like spread out the power within the parties and encourage more independent voices. They might even be open to things like ranked choice voting or like changing how we finance campaigns to reduce the influence of special interest groups.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and think about how the founding fathers would react to another huge part of modern America, the insane size and influence of corporations. Chapter 4 in the blog dives into economic power and corporate influence, and this is something that like really affects us all.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the difference between their world and ours is just mind-blowing, right? These guys were living in a time of small farms, local businesses, very little international trade. The idea of corporation that's bigger and richer than some countries, they couldn't even fathom that.
It's kind of crazy to think about how much power these corporate giants have over our lives. They control like the whole supply chain for so many things. They shape how we think about products through advertising. They even control the information we see through social media. It's a level of power that the founders never had to deal with.
The blog points out how blown away they'd be by like just the sheer size and scope of these corporations. And they'd probably be pretty skeptical of the laws that have given corporations so much power, especially this whole idea of corporations being treated as like persons with the same rights as people.
Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, the founders were all about protecting individual liberty, so it's hard to imagine them being okay with corporations, these huge profit-driven machines having the same rights as citizens. And it gets even trickier when you think about how corporations use those rights to, like, influence elections and get the laws they want.
Right. Imagine trying to explain to them how corporations can spend unlimited amounts of money to support candidates and lobby for laws that benefit them. They'd flip out. Remember, they were super worried about factions and power getting concentrated in the hands of a few. They'd see this corporate influence as a direct attack on democracy.
It makes you wonder if they'd feel like the average person's voice just gets drowned out by all the corporate money in Washington.
Totally. They might worry that this kind of corporate dominance could squash opportunities for small businesses and regular people. Like, it creates a system where a tiny group of people have way too much control over the rules of the game.
So what do you think they'd say we should do about it? I mean, they were big believers in capitalism and free markets, so they probably wouldn't want to, like, dismantle the whole system, right?
True, but they might push for some serious changes. The blog suggests they'd probably be into stronger antitrust laws, to break up monopolies and stop companies from getting too big. And they might also support, like campaign finance reform, to limit how much money can be used in politics. And I bet they'd push for policies that promote economic fairness and opportunity for everyone, not just the rich and powerful.
So it sounds like they'd want a system where economic power is more spread out and where the government steps in to make sure the rules are fair for everyone. Not necessarily like a socialist utopia or anything, but a capitalist system with a strong focus on fairness and opportunity.
Yeah, they'd argue that the government's job is to make sure the economy works for the people, not just for the wealthy and well-connected.
This chapter is a good reminder that, like, economic power and political power are totally intertwined, and that we got to be careful to make sure our economic system doesn't end up undermining our democracy. Now, before I move on to how the Founding Fathers might view the evolution of civil rights and how education's changed in America, let's take a quick break.
When we come back, we'll dive into some of the most fundamental questions about equality and opportunity in the 21st century. So this whole idea of economic fairness, opportunity for everyone, it really makes you think about how we've, actually lived up to those ideals of equality, right? Like the ones in the Declaration of Independence. And that's exactly what Chapter 5 of the blog dives into. It asks, like, how would the founders, with their own kind of complicated views on equality, how would they react to all the progress we've made in civil rights over the centuries?
It's a good question. And you got to remember the context here, right? These guys were living in a world where, like, slavery was legal, women couldn't vote, the idea of being a full citizen, that was only for a very select few. So how would they even process all the changes we've seen? The blog suggests they'd probably be like a mix of amazed and kind of uneasy. Amazed at how far we've come in expanding like who we the people really means, but also uneasy about the fact that we're still fighting for true equality for all Americans.
Right. They'd be blown away by things we just take for granted now, like the end of slavery, women getting the right to vote, the whole civil rights movement. These were huge movements that completely changed America, They pushed the boundaries of the founders' vision in ways they couldn't have imagined.
It's like they planted the seed and it grew into this massive tree with branches going everywhere. The blog points out how impressed they'd be by some of the big Supreme Court decisions, like Brown v. Board of Education, the one that desegregated schools, and Obergefell v. Hodges, the one that made same-sex marriage legal. These cases used the Constitution to fight discrimination and give rights to groups that were always left out.
Totally. But at the same time, they'd see that we're still not there yet. There's still racial inequality in the justice system. The gap between the rich and poor keeps growing. We're still debating things like affirmative action. It would show them that the whole all men are created equal thing, it's still not a reality for a lot of Americans.
And it's not just about race and gender either. What about LGBTQ rights, people with disabilities, immigrants, groups that the founders probably didn't even think about when they were writing the Constitution? How would they deal with all the complexities of identity and equality in the 21st century?
That's a tough one, right? It would force them to really confront the limits of their own understanding of equality and figure out how to apply these basic principles to a society that's way more diverse and complicated than anything they knew.
It's like this never-ending conversation between generations, you know? Each generation keeps pushing the boundaries of what it means to be truly equal. The founders laid the foundation, but it's up to us to keep questioning, keep challenging, keep moving forward.
The blog makes a good point about how progress isn't about reaching some perfect end goal. It's about constantly trying to live up to the ideals in our founding documents. And that means being willing to look at our own biases, have tough conversations, and keep working towards a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of stuff here, from the growing power of the federal government to all the challenges of technology, the complexities of equality, all that. But there's one more chapter in the blog I want to touch on, and it gets to the heart of what the founders thought was absolutely crucial for a healthy democracy education.
Yeah, Chapter 6 is all about education, citizenship, and civic virtue. And it really highlights how much the founders believed in having an educated population. They saw education not just as a way for people to succeed, but as like the foundation of a strong republic.
They believed that if people were informed and engaged, that was the best way to prevent tyranny and make sure the government actually served the people. They'd probably be pretty amazed by how easy it is to get an education in America now, you know? We have public schools, colleges, libraries, so many resources they couldn't even dream of.
True, but the blog suggests they wouldn't be completely satisfied with how education works today. They might be worried about how we've shifted to seeing education, mostly, as a way to get a good job, instead of seeing it as a way to create informed, engaged citizens who can actually participate in a democracy.
So it's like we're great at producing workers, but not so great at producing citizens.
Exactly. The founders would probably say we need to focus more on teaching things like critical thinking, how to evaluate information, how to have civil conversations, the skills you need to figure out what's true, form your own opinions, and have thoughtful debates. And that's more important than ever now, with all the information overload and echo chambers online.
Right, and they were also huge on this idea of civic virtue, basically that citizens have a responsibility to be involved in public life and contribute to the common good. They'd probably be all about things like community service, political activism, even just staying informed about what's going on and talking about the issues that affect our communities.
The blog suggests they'd see this lack of civic engagement as a real danger to our democracy. They'd remind us that a republic only works if people are actively involved in shaping it.
And it's not just about voting every few years, right? It's about being informed, being involved, holding our leaders accountable, and being part of the conversation about what kind of country we want to live in.
That's the whole point of what the founders were trying to create, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, and that's a responsibility we all share.
So what have we learned from this deep dive into the minds of the founding fathers?
Well, I think they'd be both impressed by how far we've come and kind of worried about the challenges we're facing. They'd be amazed by all our technology, but they'd also worry about privacy and how power is concentrated in the hands of a few. They'd celebrate all the progress we've made on rights, but they'd also see that the fight for equality isn't over. And I think they'd urge us, the people who inherited their legacy, to be vigilant, engaged, and committed to keep building a more perfect union.
They'd remind us that America is a work in progress. It's always evolving. And each generation has to figure out how to live up to the ideals in our founding documents.
This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. The founders laid the groundwork, but it's up to us to keep building on their vision. So what does a more perfect union actually look like in the 21st century? That's the question I'll leave you with.